So what I'm covering today is habitat loss and habitat fragmentation in the Philippines. It's a pretty heavy topic considering it's one of the most biodiverse areas in the world, um, and also one of the most populated. So one of the main drivers of habitat loss here is deforestation and environmental exploitation. All of these activities result in habitat fragmentation, which has a really negative impact on a lot of the wildlife around here. Um, So the 2011 Philippine forest statistics, according to them, there's only about 24% of forest cover remaining in the Philippines. Some areas even have less than that, about 20%. And then out in the marine areas, unsustainable fishing methods such as dynamite and poison are used pretty often, and they harm marine areas, killing reefs and ecosystems. Over 32% of the coral reefs are actually damaged pretty badly. So the biomes associated with these are usually forested areas and then marine ecosystems surrounding the islands. The marine ecosystems are especially vulnerable just because there's so many different types all throughout the different islands. So some of the impacts of habitat fragmentation, one of the biggest ones that we'll notice all over the world are the human-wildlife interactions. Um, there's roadkill. We've all heard about alligators ending up in people's pools in Florida. A lot of this happens in the Philippines as well. And it's especially important in the Philippines because there's so many like venomous and dangerous animals down there. So it's really important that we take habitat fragmentation seriously because there are a lot of deaths that occur from snake bites. A lot of wildlife gets killed due to people not really liking them being in their houses. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then reproduction for these animals becomes more difficult. So the picture here is a Philippine eagle. It's actually Philippines' national bird, but there's not a lot of them left. So it's a good example of how small populations are pretty vulnerable to extinction, and it's hard for them to move from fragment to fragment to reproduce. So that's just one thing to keep in mind as well. So moving on to island biogeography. So as you can see, the Philippines obviously have thousands of islands, and each of these islands kind of has developed in their own way. So something that we've learned is, larger islands near the equator have more extensive biodiversity. A really good example of this is actually New Guinea. It's probably one of the most unique places in the world, and the Philippines have their own unique species all throughout the different islands, especially on the large island. New Zealand would be another example of that. These are all just species that I found from the Philippines that are endemic. So adaptive radiation, it's one of my favorite things to talk about. It occurs on islands and even ocean trenches. So one of the best examples of this or one of the most studied, are the finches on the Galapagos Islands. So basically, one species will radiate, if you will, to surrounding islands and then develop differently. And this results in new species, subspecies, all branching from a similar ancestor. And this is actually interesting. It also occurs in ocean trenches. So pictured below is a snailfish, and trenches function in much the same way that islands do, in that the deep-dwelling animals that live in them can't really move from trench to trench because that's where they survive best. So snailfish have adapted to each trench uniquely. And this happens throughout the Philippine Islands as well with different animals, reptiles, amphibians. A good example of these are these frogs here. So it's present in a clade of frogs. The genus is Calula in the Philippine Islands. They're all a similar species, however, they've all developed differently on each island. And they're all endemic to each island, so, each one is unique. And what's cool about them is they've developed so differently that some of them are even terrestrial, some of them live in the trees, some of them are semi-aquatic. So it's really cool how they're able to develop so differently just because of the island that they live on. So some of the patterns and processes that affect habitat fragmentation as well as habitat destruction. One of them is going to be climate and weather. So these are especially important to remember in the Philippines. because this area is so close to the equator that it has a pretty steady climate. So if anything were to change drastically over time, a lot of the wildlife and plants would not have a very easy time surviving, especially since, you know, flooding and even drying out, a lot of the rainforests could dry out in the future depending on what happens. Just any small change, you know. So hunting and deforestation, again, has a huge impact on wildlife and habitats in the area. Hunting has even more of an impact on smaller populations, and these eagles are, again, Philippine eagles. So roads and increasing railways, these are a big deal just because of how common they're becoming. I mean, the first railways began in the 1800s. So obviously it makes it pretty difficult for wildlife to travel from place to place, especially between their habitats. So in such a diverse environment, especially with smaller populations, ecological meltdown can occur easily from losses of plants and predators. Pictured here are the Philippine freshwater crocodiles, sorry. And these are actually a keystone species. Not only when they're little, they provide food for other animals, but when they're larger, they do help in controlling populations, much in the same way that wolves and polar bears do up here in Alaska. Climate change can impact local rainfall, overhunting of keystone species, just to reiterate what I said before. Here's a beautiful picture of a sea turtle in a mangrove swamp. So this is one other example how climate change can have an impact on island areas such as the Philippines. Much of the islands are surrounded by mangrove swamps. So if these swamps were to disappear or the mangrove trees were to die for any reason, these transitional areas between ocean and land would disappear, meaning tsunamis, hurricanes, typhoons, all of those, you know, forces of nature would impact the forests a lot harder than if they had the mangrove swamps to kind of buffer that area between them and the sea. So they're a really important buffer for the environment. So some of the conservation solutions, I didn't find a lot of these that the Philippines were implementing themselves, but they could certainly take note. Well, I mean, I guess they did do this. The Philippines, in 2012, I did find that they declared over 240 areas and 35,000 square kilometers for protection. It's really important especially because the Philippines have such a high population of people, their protected areas are more important than ever. And then one thing that they could do is create easier passageways between the habitat fragments. The top picture here is a passageway in Canada, I believe. It's either Canada or somewhere in Scandinavia, but it allows the wildlife to pass over the road. And then the picture on the bottom is a passageway for elephants. It's actually in a more extensive area of rivers and flat areas, so that elephants can move between their habitats as needed without human interference. And then one thing the Philippines really could do is control the overexploitation of certain resources, especially since their population is growing so high. They really need to keep an eye on how many resources they use, how they go about harvesting those resources. Using dynamite to kill fish probably isn't the best idea. So that's my presentation.